Hey everyone, sorry, I know this is a little bit late. I had a busy weekend, but today's topic is augmented versus virtual reality, and specifically my study is going to be looking at augmented versus virtual reality and laparoscopic simulation. What is the difference? Let's just jump into it. Let's just jump into it. There we go. The background of this is that the article was published in 2007, which I think is important because it's fairly old, at least, especially relative to the other studies we've been looking at. So that's just something to keep in mind. The findings, I think, still hold up generally, but it is something to keep in mind that there were more limitations, especially I think on VR, than there would be if we did it today. Um, Essentially, it targeted something that was an agreed upon necessity in the field of laparoscopic training. Laparoscopic surgery involves inserting a bunch of tiny tubes into holes that are less than 1 centimeter in length in the abdomen with something that's called a laparoscope, and you use that to kind of like do a bunch of surgical stuff in someone. I don't know exactly what it is, but the article doesn't go into that because that's not really the focus. But what's important is it's something that uses very small incisions in the body, and so it's very hard to train for, something that you can't really test on a physical person unless you're doing it. So there have been all these different methods to train it over the years, and as technology has advanced, those methods have advanced, so that leads us naturally to AR and VR. As these technologies emerge, different companies and different groups try to find new ways to implement those into laparoscopic surgery anyway. So essentially, this study came about because these two, AR and VR had come about as a new technology to try to make a laparoscopic simulation for to help people learn. And this study is testing which of the two is favored among students and people who are learning and people who have experience doing it. So the methodology for this study, I think, is pretty simple. There were 90 participants in both the laparoscopic training methods. So what 90 in VR, 90, the same 90 in VR and AR, rather, not two different groups of 90. They were divided among three groups of expertise. There were experts who had done more than 10 laparoscopic surgeries or participated in them in some capacity. There were novices who had no training at all or no experience at all, and then there were intermediate who had some experience and some training, but they weren't fully trained like the experts were. The participants were asked to fill out a questionnaire about their experience with the AR and VR system after they had used them. So they used the system, they used the same task on each system, and immediately after they did a task, they had a questionnaire that they filled out about it where it said, they rated both their opinion on the haptic feedback of it and kind of the physical, the way the system itself worked, and then the user experience of the system, whether or not they liked it, whether or not they found it intuitive, and whether or not they thought it was a good training tool. The main focus of the test was to look at which method was more realistic, which method trained the users better, and which was more intuitive to the users. Um, the authors hypothesized that the AR simulation would be more effective because of its realistic haptic feedback and improved objective performance assessment. Essentially, the AR simulator had a well, not an actual torso. It had a simulation torso that they used to test out, to do the augmented reality on, essentially. So they needed an actual physical object there, and because of that, the authors hypothesized that AR would be the better fit for this particular service because in VR, the haptic feedback wouldn't be as well tuned and it wouldn't be as realistic. And in AR, it would have more objective ways to calculate the performance of the individuals. So Pro MIS or Promise maybe AR simulator. It's a torso-shaped instrument with three cameras to track movement and objects. The two cameras on the side track the objects. Excuse me. Then the one in the middle is the one that you see right on the bottom picture there. That's the one that gets really up close. It instructs how to perform each task with a brief instruction, or with a brief description, excuse me, and then on-screen instructions. And it tracks things like time, instrument path length, and smoothness of the movement of each instrument. That is to know, when you're getting to holes that are 1 centimeter long, going just a little bit too far in one direction could do some real damage. So tracking that stuff lets the people conducting the study and the people who would theoretically be using this equipment know how well they're doing in terms of if this were an actual surgery. So that's all very important stuff, and time is just making sure that they're doing it in a timely fashion. I believe it was 5 minutes they had for each task, and past that it would just boot them out. LapSim VR simulator, that's the VR option here. It consists of two handles with sensors. It's pretty standard. On the middle picture, you can see a picture of it there. And it displays a virtual representation of VR tasks, as you can see in the bottom picture. The parameters recorded by this one include time, tissue damage, instrument path length, and a pass-fail score. This one was very similar to the AR one, except for it was VR, obviously, and I feel like we have pretty good experience with AR and VR. I don't need to go super in depth there, but I think what is interesting is that the AR did not have a pass-fail score, and it didn't really have a score at all, so much as it just tracked the movement and it didn't calculate tissue damage because there was actual tissue to see the damage on. So the results of this study were that the haptic simulation of the VR software was found to be unrealistic by the expert group. The AR equivalent was rated almost unanimously as good or above. About 90% of the people said it was either good or very good with the AR simulation, which makes sense because it was an actual object they were interacting with. Both the training qualities and the realism of the Pro MAS or Promise AR simulator was rated as very high. I mean, a 4.5 and 4.1 respectively out of 5, which is very good. Essentially, that means that both and all across all groups, it was unanimously agreed that it was a good training tool, that people learned a lot from it, and it could be used effectively to actually train people how to perform these surgeries. And the tuning of it was very good. It very well captured what a laparoscopic surgery feels like, literally and figuratively, and it was a good simulation for one. The VR LapSim VR simulator I wrote scored lower in both training qualities and realism. Specifically, realism was very low. I think it was 2.15. But honestly, it was relatively high in the training qualities. A mean of 2.94 out of 5 isn't great. It's not remarkable, but it's a lot higher than I thought it would be. And the paper itself even notes that it's a higher mean on that than it is on its realism, which is interesting because it kind of means that they're getting the idea of what they need to do across, and just the specifics are different. Which I just thought was an interesting thing to note, because you would think that you would want it to be as realistic as possible in order to be effective, but here we're kind of seeing a divide in those two, where people said that even though it wasn't super realistic, they thought it was a relatively good means of training anyway. So the discussion and conclusions, the paper discusses the lack of validating studies for both LapSim and Promise or Pro MAS. I don't know which way it's pronounced. I'm sorry. I should have just picked one. And it suggests that more depth needs to be used before it's a widespread accepted implementation of these two in terms of training. Essentially, it's saying that while they found the AR to be more effective than the VR in terms of how the people rated it, that doesn't mean that it should be implemented. There obviously still needs to be a lot more testing on it. And the VR system had previously been found to be less useful than the standard box training kits, and this finding was supported, as was hypothesized. The haptic feedback was found to be the most important thing to laparoscopic studies, and therefore AR had an advantage, basically because AR you're interacting with a physical object, the AR is just going to inherently have an advantage there. But also, something that I thought was interesting that they didn't really note too much. I would be interested to see if they did a more fine-tuned VR system, like if they were to try to implement it now. Would they be able to make a VR system that people felt the haptic feedback was comparable to the AR system? That probably should have been a discussion question, now that I'm thinking about it. I just thought it was very interesting because they specifically point this out, that the haptic feedback was the main difference, and that the VR's haptic feedback just wasn't tuned very well. But they never really touch upon, well, could we tune it well, or is it better to just go with AR? And I think that's something that's really interesting to think about. So transitioning from that into my discussion questions, age is always an issue with studies like these. Do you think we could make a more effective VR system now than the AR system they had then, or than an AR system we could make now? If not, do you think we ever will? Do you think VR will ever be to a point where we can get that kind of haptic feedback, we can get that kind of feeling that is present in AR and not in VR, that makes it so we can effectively use the software? Why or why not? Kind of like I said earlier, I think an interesting question is if they were to fine tune the haptic feedback in the VR, is there still something in the AR that would make it more effective? Or at that point, are they fundamentally interchangeable? And in that case, would VR be more useful because of its less need for physical things, except for the VR headset, more ubiquitous control, stuff like that? I don't know. It's interesting to think about. Discussion. I kind of rambled a little bit there. Sorry. Discussion question number 2. In this specific instance, augmented reality is found to be more effective than virtual reality. Can you think of an industry that would benefit from using VR in training more than AR, and what might that look like? So, something specific where people are could use VR to train. What might that VR training look like? And which do you find more appealing in the work you would like to do post-graduation, and why? Is there something specific where you think AR or VR would be better? Yeah, so that's basically my paper. Thanks for watching.